Welcome to the Green Urbanist, a podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Today's episode is a collaboration with the Human City podcast. The Human City is a podcast hosted by Stig Terrebonne that focuses on making cities, well, more human, making people healthier, happier, and facilitating community through urbanism. In this episode, Stig has joined me to share his top lessons learned from interviewing some of the leading urbanists in the USA. We cover some really interesting topics, including why urbanism needs branding, how communities are formed on interaction, and why the solutions for towns and villages are not the same as those for big cities. This episode is a collaboration because I'm also appearing on Stig's podcast, The Human City, to talk about my lessons learned from hosting The Green Urbanist. That episode is out right now, so do head over to the Human City podcast. If not to listen to me, then at least to listen to all the other amazing guests he's had on. Links to all my social media and Stigs are in the podcast description. Thanks very much, and please enjoy our conversation. Hello, Stig. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Ross. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So we're here to talk about yourself and talk about your excellent podcast, the Human City podcast. So why don't you just tell us who are you and tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah, most definitely. So I'm Stig. I am out of Los Angeles, California, the United States. So a little bit different, but basically maybe 3 years or so ago, 2.5, I read a book called Happy City by Charles Montgomery, which is a classic.
Love it.
And so I studied engineering, and it just blew my mind. I really had no clue how much like the design of a city impacted how we felt and how we moved about our life. So I was just on it. I was like, I got to share this. I got to do something about this. So I created the podcast, and basically the point of the podcast is to talk about how can we design cities like with a human lens first. So as opposed to like what makes sense for money, what makes sense for like what just looks good. And there's a big difference between what looks good and what feels good,
Right.
So the whole point of the podcast is to advocate for how do we build places that are great for people. So like that's happiness, like a way of finding community, a way of finding like your job, of like creating a community. It's all of that. And so it's interview based, and I basically interview people from like in policy and urban design, architecture, some like nonprofit advocates, some business people, all about how can we make better places. So it's sort of wide ranging, but yeah.
That's great. And you've had some really big names on as well in the sort of urbanism community in the US. So it's great to listen to them.
Yeah, there's definitely, I've had a few like really popular people who are out there making like beautiful work where, when I'm talking to them, I'm like, I can't believe I'm talking to this person, so definitely it's been really exciting to learn from everyone and to see what they're doing. So I love it. So
that's awesome. Well, you're here to tell us a bit about what you've learned interviewing these interesting people. So why don't we jump right in? What's your first lesson?
Yeah. So I got 7 lessons for everyone, and I've sort of compiled from all the people I've spoken to. I wanted to share with you. Number 1, urbanism needs branding. So I've come to find this, especially with a lot of the like architecture or maybe like these firms, they have a very similar way of showing their image, which is sort of like uniform across format, where when everyone's doing the same thing, it starts to become non-noticeable. And what I'm seeing is people aren't engaged with urbanism. When they hear about zoning or housing policy, their eyes roll over.
Yeah.
So what's happening is that people need to start rebranding how we talk about urbanism and how we share these ideas, because we need to get people interested and sort of start to take a part in city building. So because it affects all of us, and because people are living and using the city, we all have a part in this. So we need to figure out as urbanists how we can sell it. You know, like I hate to say the word sell, but how do we get people really interested? So urbanism needs new branding. It needs a new way to be pictured in people's brains, a new way to be useful for people. So I'm talking about like first principles. How do we get people to change how they picture urbanism in their brain? So that's what branding is, and that's what selling is. That's number one.
That's great. And you're so right, because there's so many places in the US and also in Europe where, you know, the default that people expect is suburbia. And if someone wants to come along and do something that's a bit more urban, a bit more dense, and has that sort of, you know, urban feel to it, you do need that sort of strong messaging and strong branding to help people,
totally,
you know, feel excited about it.
I agree. Yeah. Like, it's a problem in the US where they think, oh, a city, urbanism. I'm going to talk about this later, but New York City, I don't want to live in New York City, you know? So like, people have this image in their head that we need to change. So it's more than just a or B, you know? And I also think it's just uncool. Like it just comes down to like, it's not cool. So I think that like we need to make it cool. Like that's what I'm talking about branding. Like how do we make something really so interesting that people are like repping it?
Yeah,
you know?
That's great.
So,
great message. Okay, let's go along. Lesson number 2.
Yeah, number 2, incrementalism. So a lot of the cities, how they're born is from one by one. So someone shows up and creates a little shop, and then they have water there, a well. So someone else shows up right next door. They build their little shop. And then that happens over and over because they build so close, because all the resources are in that area. All the people go to that area. There's economies of scales of being close. So, and when that happens, because it's different people building different buildings, people feel ownership over the space. And then there's this sort of like uniqueness and there's diversity that's built in because so many people are having a part in building their neighborhoods. So that has created some of the most beautiful places in the world. Like we go to these old towns and neighborhoods all over the world that we're just like, wow, this is so beautiful. Why don't we do this anymore? And I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't happen anymore, but I mean, we see developers that create huge, like a big block of one building, and we think, oh, it's ugly. And so we don't take ownership over that because someone else is doing it, coming from somewhere else to build that. And it's so big and like huge, monolithic that we sort of like we can't like connect with it. You know, when there's a small incremental approach, there's so much more benefits to how we use and feel about the city. So I had someone on the podcast named John Anderson, and he started what's called the Incremental Development Alliance. Basically, he teaches community members how to like build in their community. And so a lot of his students, they go and build like small, like infill developments in their community, but they do exactly what the community wants. They're connected to people in the neighborhood. So like there's so much more ownership and there's so much more connection, and like these, like the neighborhoods they build are beautiful. And that's sort of like a new way to approach city building that is different from sort of what's been happening in recent times.
That's fantastic. I mean, it can be really difficult for designers to step back and let someone else, you know, let the community take the lead. We always want to like just design everything from the top. So I love that other perspective, you know. And you're right, that's how, you know, most of our history was people doing that, just incrementally building up places. And I think there's also, like, I'm not saying we should just not have like a top level like thought of how things lay out. Definitely important, but there is like different ways to approach things, or maybe like an urban designer to think about how you can incentivize more of that, you know. So in certain confinements, I guess. Great. Yeah.
So maybe I'll move on to number 3.
Sure.
Density versus crowding. So this has happened a lot of people have been talking about this since the pandemic has occurred, where sort of density is good in urbanism, right? Like we want density. But it's sort of being attacked now that the pandemic has happened. Everyone's like, whoa, we don't want to live in cities. Everyone's on top of each other. And I think it's really helpful to draw a line between crowding and density. So in a lot of places, they're dense, but they're not crowded. So there's like Copenhagen, for example, has neighborhoods that are super dense, but they're not like sky rises and people aren't sleeping on top of each other. There's a way that we can lay out cities to sort of bring all the infrastructure, bring all the people together and create a community, but not build something that's unhealthy. You know, I think so. The image that we have in our head of like a density is like New York City. So
or
thinking
Hong Kong,
about
or somewhere like that.
Yeah, like Hong Kong. So how do we have to like get the image across that density is not crowding. Density is building a neighborhood that's is more connected and close, but not like unhealthily, you know, in an unhealthy way. So
absolutely, there's that middle point, isn't there, between the suburban detached house and the skyscraper.
Yeah,
you know, that's where all the good stuff is, in the middle there.
Yeah,
you don't have to go to the extremes.
Cool. Number 4. Policies, zoning, and building codes need to go deeper than safety. So, like sort of in the U.S., building codes came about in to like basically provide safety. So, like, how do we need to put rules in so this doesn't burn down, or so people don't fall down the stairs, or there's all these rules that are put in place when certain problems occurred, and it sort of created this monster of rules that had no thought about how it looks or how it feels. So like when people build, they'll build to the code, and it ends up creating these structures that just don't make sense, you know, or they affect the streetscape really heavily. So like I had a person on my podcast recently, and he built in Singapore, and basically, or he works a lot in Singapore, and basically he was talking about how the government and how the policy institutions work. They have rules in their building codes that incentivize you to put public space.
Right.
Like you could get more density if you put more public space. So there's ways that you could structure rules to like build better places, you know? So if we need people that are writing or rewriting our codes or zoning to basically incentivize better building, you know? So for like urban greening, I'm sure there's a myriad of ways that we could get greening built by using these incentives to builders, and thinking really highly about how we write our rules to be conducive to that. So yeah, I think that's super important from a policy level, to be thinking about how places feel and how places look, and how we can incentivize a better, more greener future.
It's amazing how little value is given to creating good, high quality places in things like zoning. And in the UK, I mean, we don't have a zoning zone-based planning system. We have a sort of discretionary planning system. So people just make applications, and then we decide, you know,
does it work?
On a case-by-case basis, does it work? You know, and that has loads of problems as well. And actually, there's talk now from the government about, you know, creating a zone-based system for the UK, for England actually, because Wales and Scotland decide separately. But for England, they're talking about bringing in a zone-based system. And but it's interesting to have your perspective to say, like, it probably has a lot of the same problems, just looking at it from a different way.
Yeah, no, it definitely creates a lot of problems. And not to mention like the racial problems that came with zoning, like in the US, like when zoning was instituted, a lot of it was like, this is for single family lots only, aka, you know, a certain population of people can only live here. So there's a lot of like stuff baked into zoning that's more than just like separating industrial waste environments from living, which I guess makes sense, you know, when it came about because there was a lot of industry and pollutants that they didn't want to live next to that. That makes sense for zoning. But we're not in that world anymore, you know, at least not fully, where we don't need to have such hardcore zoning restrictions, you know. And it just makes it harder to build, honestly, for zoning. Like a lot of our housing demands in the US especially could be fixed if we were more if we didn't have so much rules to build, you know, like it makes it so hard to build because now we have can only go certain areas, and it changes pricing, and yeah, there's a lot baked
Wow,
into
yeah.
that.
And as urbanists, I mean, we're always pushing for more mixing of uses. You know,
Yeah.
you want
Yeah.
residences with shops and the restaurants and everything all together, because that's how you get this sort of vibrant neighborhood. But if the system is in place to separate those things, it's very hard to get it right.
Straight up. So yeah.
Okay, maybe I'll complain less about the English system after hearing that.
I don't know. Yeah, you'd have to it'd be an interesting comparison, to see what's more effective. So I'm moving on. Number five, a village is not a town, is not a city. So, I've had a guest on my podcast. Her name is Laura Clemens. She's out of Wharton, Texas, and she's always talking about how all of the things we talk about in city building and designing never work in her town. She lives in a small town in Texas where there's no zoning there. There's no real rules, not a lot of infrastructure. There's not a lot of economy, so there's not a lot of money that's involved. But it's a beautiful city. There's a really great downtown neighborhood, and they have a different political view and a way of living and thoughts. And so when we start to talk about urbanism and density, they're really turned off by that. Right. So we need to think about how we can change our answers to help people in these communities that maybe have a different situation, and to know that when we're saying urbanism, we're not saying New York City. We're saying building a good community for you that has a good, downtown, a place you love, a place to meet your community. It's not building skyscrapers. So I think a lot of times, or a lot of the urbanists I speak to, they say we have to be very careful about for speaking about a village or a town or a city, because everything has a different answer. Yeah. And I'm sure you deal with this a lot in your work.
It's such a good point. I'm glad you brought it up, and it's probably something I need to be more conscious of when I'm on the podcast talking about these things in sometimes in quite general terms, but you can apply general principles to everywhere. And I'd also add to that as well that the solutions for a North American city or a European city are not necessarily the same solutions for an African city or an Asian city or in the Middle East.
So true.
And there's a long history of foreign consultants exporting our urban ideals to these places, and they just don't work very well. Yeah. And sometimes it's about these places have certain, they look to the Western world and they have certain ambitions. And so, for instance, just look at Dubai is full of glass skyscrapers, which is basically the worst building typology for their climate. It's just because they just
all that heat.
Exactly. Why would you have a fully glazed skyscraper in Dubai when it's so hot? And so there is these, it's a really, really valid point. So thank you for bringing that up.
And also we need, how do we make places unique? If you could build for what's local there, people are probably more likely to want to go there and enjoy that, so it's not just for because it's rational, I guess, but it serves a unique need for the community and who they are, so yeah. Okay. Number 6, community is a function of interaction. So, well, a lot of times now, especially in the US, there's a lot of polarization of ideas and people don't understand where you come from. It's harder to build community because of the internet age. There's a lot of problems with sort of loneliness, and I think what the problem there is that we're not getting enough interaction. So when people are able to see each other, or to even just be next to someone, it could be the grocery store clerk, to see someone, just being okay, and you meet them, you don't have to speak to them. It sort of creates this bond and trust that you didn't have before, that you can't get over the internet. So once you start to meet people like that, you start to understand that they're not so different from you. So once you start interacting with these people, you can start building this community because you start to build this trust. So I think a lot of the problems that we have as like communities, and like all the fighting that we do can be solved by just simply like interacting and seeing each other.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I have a friend that lives in North Carolina, and they were saying they were at a like a cafe once, and the owner, you know, was a very Southern person, and a person that was like Sikh came in, and they are, you know, they have a turban and they look different from the certain person there. And they were like best of friends, like someone you think would be very much opposed to having like the that person in their area, like, you know, just a Southern American person.
Yeah.
They were totally good friends. So there's a sort of this power in like interacting and seeing someone and talking to them that is we totally take for granted. Like seeing someone and yeah, getting that connection is like the first step in creating community and building sort of like I guess trust and getting out of loneliness. So that's sort of like a big reason for building places that are for people, is for creating this interaction so that we can sort of build community.
That's beautiful. I love that example, and it's so true. I mean, I think people who interact with, let's say, people outside of their socioeconomic group tend to be a lot less worried about those people because once you've met them, you know, if you've met refugees, or you've met people from a certain country that are, you know, and you've had a conversation with them, then suddenly you stop being worried about the unknown. Like, what are these people doing here? What are they going to do? Like, oh, yeah, I know what they're doing. They're just like me, you know. It takes the mystery and the fear away from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, it's super true. I think like if we could design to optimize for creating that interaction, we can just start to understand each other and have a better, more like peaceful world, you know? So that's what it's about. And that's why the podcast exists, to advocate for more human-centric spaces. Okay.
It's great. And I mean, I think there's definitely architectural ways you can bring that in. I mean, I was just thinking of, I have a friend who lives in Zurich, and he lives in this big apartment block. That's like a big perimeter block, and it has like a communal kind of green area in the middle. And he lives on the ground floor, and there's probably hundreds of people who live in this big apartment block. But because he's on the ground floor and he has like a little garden out the back, he sits out there and he says hello to everyone who passes by. And he has tons of friends in the building because they all know him. He's the guy who lives on this corner. And they just see him in his back garden, and he waves to everyone. He says hello. He knows all the kids and everything. And it's beautiful. And I'm like, I don't know anyone in my building. You know, I've been here 3 years, you know?
Yep. It's so true. Like there's like, like the architecture, if you could design that in to build that interaction, like I'm sure he's a lot happier for that, you know, to have all those friends, you know, and I think we all need a little more of that.
Oh yeah.
We all need a little more happiness.
Real life interaction, you know?
Yeah. Real life interaction. So, number 7, this is the last one.
Okay.
The future of cities will need private and public middle persons. So I recently had someone on the show. His name is Matthew Clark. He's like the principal, like CEO at a like firm nonprofit called the Design Trust for Public Space. It's out of New York. Basically, there's intermediary that sit between like a lot of public people and then a lot of private businesses, and they help get these. They advocate for public space mostly, but they help get these ideas and these people that want to do things in communities actually done by sort of creating this network, you know. And they do a lot more than that, of course, but I think there's a lot of power in having someone there that's willing to get them on the same page and get them moving towards the same goal, you know, because a lot of times, especially in the US, it's a lot of headbutting. There's like, I just want to do my thing. All right, stop it from stopping me, you know. But we shouldn't be working that way. I think we both have the same goals, or we should, and both have the same ideas. So a really like a position that should, and I think will exist in the future, is that person or that group that sits in between them and is always willing or is pushing to get the same ideas out there and pushed forward, you know?
Yeah, that's really important. And actually, I mean, I think that's the team that I work with, when we do a lot of our work, we play that role sometimes, because often we'll work.
There it is.
There you go. Our client is the local authority, is the city planners, and they've had, a history of being very having this quite aggressive relationship with like local developers and local residents. And everyone is almost pulling in different directions. And often we come in as like a neutral kind of middleman to be like, actually, we all actually want the same things. We're just maybe using different language. I mean, often that's it, and so, yeah, you're totally right. And it's hugely important. It definitely needs to happen more. Yeah.
So it exists. You're doing it already.
Yeah. But I never thought of it in those, like, it's just something we did. I didn't think of it in those sort of terms.
Yeah. I mean, necessary. Well, I'm glad that things are already moving on.
That was awesome, Stig. Thank you. Really, really enjoyed that. I learned a lot. It was a great conversation.
Yeah. No, thank you for having me. That was a blast. Just to like get the time to sort of like consolidate all the lessons learned. There's been quite a few people and they've had ranging ideas. So, thank you for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. How can people find your podcast, learn more about it?
Yeah. So it's called Human City Podcast. So just Google it. I'm sure you can find it. I'm on all the podcast streaming platforms, so feel free to search it. I'm on Twitter at Human City Pod. And then I'm also on Instagram as well, at Human City Podcast. So it's human.city on Instagram. So check it out. I have quite a few episodes in the past.
Yeah, it's great. I really enjoy it. I can definitely recommend it. Really, really good stuff.
Thank you, Ross. I really appreciate you having me on.
Absolute pleasure. Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, hell yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you.